Hello and welcome to Rewind Reviews, the podcast where we take a look at movies from our past and ask the age-old question, was that any good? And this week we are tackling a movie that I have been kind of scared to cover on this podcast. Because all logic tells me this movie probably wouldn't hold up, right? This is me last week when I'm choosing it, right? I am nervous to pick this. I've been nervous to pick this the whole time we've done this because I love this movie. It's The Cable Guy as a kid. I loved this movie so much. But it is... I saw it so many times. So much of it is ingrained in my brain. And every time I've thought back on it in recent years, in adult years, especially around Rewind Reviews when it's been a thing I've thought about, I have worried that the scenes that are playing out a certain way in my head play out worse or don't work or are tonally disparate when actually put into a physical movie that I'm going to sit and watch as an adult with my critical hat on, you know, with my I'm going to analyze the movie hat on. So I've been very nervous to do this one, but I believe this is your first time seeing The Cable Guy, Chris. Is that correct?
Yeah, I do sort of have not history with the film, but I do vividly remember as a kid, and you know, whenever I saw the poster to this movie, going, "Oh, that's weird that Jim Carey made like a horror movie,
Right?
in and amongst all those madcap comedies."
Yeah,
I would just think that because the poster is in my head at least quite iconic.
It is. No, it's 100% iconic.
Yeah, so I was just like, I'd sort of always assumed that. Yeah, so yeah, it's the first time seeing it, and but very aware of the film, and always thinking, and to be honest with you, going, oh, I'm not too bothered about seeing that movie. That's not a particular dislike of horror, but I think if the poster had been maybe a little more reflective of the movie, then as someone that watched Liar Liar, The Mask, The Truman Show, I can't think of too many films from, you know, that era, Jim Carrey, that I haven't seen. So I probably would have checked it out as a young'un. But I didn't, and I think, to be honest with you, because the poster made me go, that doesn't look, you know, I'm not too bothered about seeing that.
Right, yeah, and I think that's what's really interesting about this movie is because the story of the movie is about a script that was written for a simple buddy comedy, right? And then Jim Carrey getting a hold of it and being desperate to break out of his, let's say this stereotypical roles he was getting, wanting to desperately do something different. But because the bones of the thing was a comedy, and the premise ultimately becomes, it is still at its heart a comedy, and lots of physical comedy for Carey to do, it doesn't really go far enough to be that different, to be the breakout thing. But that is the challenge of the movie also, is that it's different enough that you can't market it like a normal Jim Carrey movie, because you can't have the same audience that enjoyed Ace Ventura aren't likely to enjoy this movie. So it leads you down a path of like, well, then who is this for? Is this for no one? Because it's in a really interesting position of having one foot in two different camps. And whether it threads that needle or not was my biggest sort of concern going into it. But I will say, Child Dan, if we're doing history, and for those who've never listened to this podcast before, we usually start with our history of the movie, and then we go into like just overall thoughts. And then we have a hard cut for like, now we're going to talk spoilers, and then we do the nitty gritty. That's generally what we do. Not always. We sometimes forget the format. But that's generally speaking what we do. So for my history with this movie I was an obsessive Jim Carrey fan. I watched everything he put out, and when I saw the poster for this, rather than being put off, I went, what's that? Like that, it intrigued me because it looked nothing like any other Jim Carrey movie. And when the VHS came out, I think around 1997, I think the film was 95, 96. I'm not sure exactly. I don't have that in front of me, but and then the VHS came out sort of 97 to my memory, 97, maybe 98. And I remember my parents renting it for me because it had Jim Carrey in it, and them thinking that was probably fine because, you know, what he'd done. He'd done Ace Ventura, The Mask. Like these were films that were, while having adult jokes built into them, were still ostensibly accessible to children. Dumb and Dumber being the exception, but like again, that was another one that was rented for me that I'm pretty sure I should not have seen. Do you know what I mean? Like, because they didn't know any different. Like Jim Carrey's in the movie; it's a silly comedy. That's fine. So yeah, they rent me this movie, and I'm probably I must be 10, 11. I must be 11 if it's no, I must be 10 when this movie hits VHS. Way too young to discover what a prostitute is. We'll talk about that. It's a hell of a way to learn that that's a thing.
Still eager to find out, just too young.
Yeah. 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 I was hanging out on street corners for years, just no success. Anyway, so I loved this movie as a kid, and I think what I liked about it was that it had a sort of darkness to it that young Dan hadn't seen in many movies, and made it feel special and different and unique. And I don't think I would have put it into those words, obviously, but I liked it, I think, because there wasn't any other movie like it. Like, it really was Jim Carrey with an adult twist. When you're a kid, all you want to do is grow up, right? You want to watch movies that are older than your level, always. You're always chasing after, you know, when you're 12, you want to watch movies that are 15. The second you're 15, you want to watch movies that are 18. Like, that's just the I don't know. It's just children are always desperately rushing to be adults. And I think...
I think there's a specific thing here for people like us. I think, I very specifically remember, and I think I've sort of said this to people that maybe aren't as into film and TV as us, but I remember, like, fantasizing about being able to just walk in a shop and buy like an 18 video. And by the way, I'm not talking like a rude video. I mean films that were rated 18, or like for me, the TV show Bottom was a big part of that. Like the videos or DVDs for their live shows were rated 18. And I'm like, oh, I can't wait to just be able to walk into a shop and just buy one. Like, yeah, like, do you know what I mean? I wasn't thinking, oh, I can't wait to go out drinking, or like, oh, I can't wait to drive. It was literally, oh, I can't wait to be able to buy whatever videos I want.
I was 100% the same, and I think it's really interesting because, like, for me, I think one of them was it maybe the Alien sequels, Aliens, because I feel like I saw Alien, the first one, on a TV run, and it was probably a bit edited anyway. It probably wasn't, they even when they aired them after Watershed, they still, especially with horror movies, made adjustments to them. They had to make room for the adverts anyway, but yeah, they sometimes trimmed. But I had a version that had been taped off TV of the first Alien movie and loved it, and couldn't get my hands on Aliens because that's clearly a horror movie, and I couldn't go into a shop and buy it on my own or rent it on my own. Like, that's it. That one was, I think it was labeled an 18 in the UK. I think I had a similar experience maybe with the Terminator movies, where they were difficult for me to get my hands on as a child, even though I desperately wanted them. Because I think Terminator might be one of those franchises again where I saw the second one first, and then had to go dig out the first one, but couldn't get hold of it for the age rating thing. But yeah, so you're always after more adult stuff. You want to be more grown up at all times. And the idea of a Jim Carrey movie that had a much more adult tone to it, or at least that's how I perceived it, I absolutely adored this movie, and I watched it a ton of times. And even coming into this review, tons of scenes from this movie were vivid to me, or felt vivid to me. I was worried I was about to have my memory tested. I'm happy to report that at least the scenes that I remember being in the movie are in the movie pretty much as I remember them. We'll talk about whether that all comes together, whether it actually works in a little bit. But yeah, I mean, the medieval times scene, I always remember iconic. The big satellite, iconic. Him playing like parlor games with the family after all this stuff had gone down. Couldn't, the basketball scene. So many of this movie's key scenes were still baked in my brain. And of course, Jim Carrey's performance of "Wouldn't You Want Somebody to Love," which I just was forever in my brain. I don't think I even know the original version of that song very well, but I know Jim Carrey's version of it intimately. So yeah, it's really very baked in from my youth. So I watched this with some trepidation, just a moment. But I'm very curious for yourself, because obviously you don't have any baggage. You have no biases. You didn't, you've just come in like with the vague idea that it was a darker or more horror leaning Jim Carrey film. I am curious, with that being your starting point, did this movie over or under deliver on the horror elements for you? Because I have a suspicion you're going to have found that maybe it lent more to the comedy than the horror, and it was actually tonally not quite the movie you thought it was. But we'll see.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. It's in many ways it's a psychological horror.
Right.
So it was there are horror elements based on the poster. I don't think it's fair to. I think it's fair to assume that it's not necessarily psychological horror. Like, you wouldn't necessarily expect that looking at the poster. It feels like it's more sort of slasher horror, to be honest with you, or sort of, like a more violent genre of horror. But so yes, there was more. It was more of a traditional Jim Carrey vehicle than I was expecting it to be.
Right.
But it is also a psychological horror, and in many ways, if we're segueing into headline thoughts, which I sort of assume we are, I can't. This is one of those occasions, and I think I've said this before, although I don't think I've said it in a few weeks. This is one of those occasions where, like, I'm watching the film kind of like, I'm really enjoying this movie. It's a shame we have to talk about it for an hour and 45 minutes, because I'm like, I can't necessarily pinpoint why. I'm just sucked in. Now, I have to say, because I'm just sucked in at sort of the what's going to happen. Maybe it was a little unexpected, maybe it was a little surprising. I don't think it's particularly hilarious, but the beats of what is going to happen to this guy as this person. So I guess for people that don't know, it's essentially about a guy played by Matthew Broderick who gets cable in his new apartment after recently moving out from his separation with his partner, and then Jim Carrey plays the cable guy who appears and kind of forces his way into his life gently at first. But then that ramps up and up and up throughout the movie. It goes from him randomly appearing at the same gym to playing basketball, to him sort of being there in his parents' house when he goes round. And I would say I probably enjoyed the first hour of the movie more than the last half an hour. I think I think it's probably a very deliberate thing, but I couldn't quite make up my mind. But I think it's very deliberate that it, like, not only does the sort of action and what's taking place amp up, but the sort of speed of the scenes ramps up, and the absurdity of the scenes and the gaps between scenes ramp up.
I'm so glad you said that, because I learned something about this movie doing the research, and when I watched the movie, I felt something in that last half an hour. And I was worried because I did it the wrong way round this week. I had to because of timing. I had to get my research out of the way earlier than watching the movie. And I was worried that I had created a bias, sort of a presumption about how the third act was going to play out, based on the research I'd done about what happened to the third act in production. And I literally, nothing crazy huge, but like enough that it would explain exactly what you've just talked about. And I thought I had sort of taken that bias into it and recognized it because I knew. So I think it is actually fascinating and really confirms the point, so much so that I'm not going crazy. It's really noticeable because you clocked it too, and you didn't have that that bias going in. So that's really interesting. We'll come back to that, I think, in more detail later. But that's really interesting.
Basically, for me, and it was literally, I think, at the hour mark, like, because we're still, I'll be vague here because we're still giving sort of vagues and whatever. But there's a scene where they're looking at each other and they're on the phone. Like, I think from that point, or maybe the scene before, it just kind of goes a bit into overdrive. And I've got to say, I didn't enjoy that last half an hour as much as the first hour. I got it, and I think it's the right ending that's the right third act for the film. But I enjoyed more what I was watching in the first hour, which felt, I think, a bit more psychological, as opposed to the last half an hour, which feels a bit more madcap and zany, and the less believable. Like, there are character beliefs in the third act that you're just like, are you not questioning this at all? Like, that doesn't make sense. Yeah. Like, what is happening here? Like, and yeah, so, but I do like the way one thing that the entire movie you're like, the fuck are they going to do with this? Comes together beautifully. Like, yes. I thought that was very clever. Yeah. And there's a lot of statements in the film and stuff. So yeah, I really, really did enjoy it. Like, I really enjoyed the movie. I got sucked into it properly. I got kind of really absorbed by it. I think it's promoted wrong. I don't think the poster sells the movie that it actually is. But yeah. Well, so you went in incredibly nervous. How did you feel during the watch and after the watch?
Relieved that it still turns out to mostly function. It's not perfect. There are definitely things young Dan didn't care was a problem. Like, you know, the adult wearing his critic hat Dan definitely clocked, but nothing game breaking, so to speak. The movie is still, as you just put it, very, very enjoyable. I felt myself getting sucked in. It's always an interesting sign with rewind reviews when I'm not making lots of notes during the film, because I'm just sort of along for the ride, or I'm having to pause the movie to make them because I'm not willing to make them while it's still running. And that happened a couple times during this one. I had to pause it for a minute just to make the notes because I just didn't want to, I was enjoying it so much that I was like, I don't want to miss something while quickly noting this down. So like, I think that's a good sign that I was just really into it. I agree with you. The third act is the problem. There are two reasons. One, the speed of the movie, as you said, picks up to an unusual point where it feels like scene to scene. It's just like it's like a snowball effect where it's just rolling so fast and it's picking up so much stuff as it's heading down the hill. It gets to a point where it's almost hard to keep track of where it's at because it's just rolling so quickly at that point. And there's an element of that. Some of that will be by design because, I mean, and this is where we go back to the horror thing actually, because I thought this is really interesting because this is the structure of a Paranormal Activity movie. There's something spooky wooky in the house. A couple of little things odd, the lights flickered. The cupboard door opened on its own. Starts real small and progressively gets worse and worse. And then there's a point, usually at the start of the third act of a Paranormal Activity movie, when we sort of crest the hill, so to speak, and then it's downhill with all that weight and all that momentum. And at that point, the movie is just non-stop insane shit happening until the climax, which is usually just the camera falling over because the person holding it is dead. I'm a sucker for those movies, but like I'd be lying if I didn't say they weren't formulaic. So like I'm watching this and I'm like, this is the structure of that. There's just some elements of pacing missing in the third act, but mostly I think it really works. It's way more of a comedy than I expected. And again, this is me just sort of bringing in some bias from what I'd read about the production of this, considering the goal here was to separate Jim Carrey's roles out. This is like such a Jim Carrey role. Like, he's really Jim Carreying it up. He's got the lisp. He's like doing voices. He's doing characters. When he's punching Owen Wilson in the bathroom, he's like doing little wrestling references. He's like, I got him in the, and hit the turnbuckle, Gene. He's like doing voices and weird. Just like, it's all that typical brilliant Jim Carrey physical comedy. Like, the idea that this was supposed to be a departure from his normal work is kind of baffling to me.
Yeah, that's mad.
And we'll get to that when we get
that's
to the
not
trim,
true.
I guess. Because it's a strange thing to think about looking at it. But I think it's a really effective Jim Carrey comedy. I think all of the performances are really fun. Everyone knows exactly what they're doing in this movie, I feel like. Like, everyone has a really clear idea of their character. I feel a bit bad for Matthew Broderick. There's a point in the production when he turned to the director, and we'll talk about, I don't know, you probably already noticed who directed the movie. It was directed by Ben Stiller. There's a point when Matthew Broderick turned to Ben Stiller and was like, I'm running out of ways to react to Jim in scenes. Like he's doing unique stuff all the time, and like I've only got so many ways to react to him being insane. And I'm worried there's going to be a lot of repeating my faces and my expressions throughout the movie. So I felt bad for him because the script asks him. He really has a tough role, I think, in this, because he's not allowed to match that energy. He has to stay a neutral 0. He has to be pH balanced almost the entire movie until towards the end.
Yeah, and rarely, like, if you think about The Office and you think about how Jim is the straight man to Dwight and Michael's insanity, they're not as insane as Jim Carey is here as this character is.
No.
So it's so much harder to be the straight man when the non-straight man is so off the wall. Like, that's a really hard task for Matthew Broderick to not in any way to counter that energy so much.
Yeah, 100%. And it is interesting as well because I do think Jim Carrey goes quite big, quite quick in this movie. You know, even when he's introduced, that cable guy, you know, he's like yelling and he's stomping around and he's like, well, maybe I'll leave, jerk off. And he's like, you know, he's just, he enters the movie at a 10. And like, there is a part of me that wonders if that somehow harms the ability for the movie to escalate. Because he doesn't seem even remotely normal from minute one. There's red flags everywhere instantly.
Not only that, and you know, look, Jim Carrey has delivered some, you know, incredible performances. You know, often potentially at the expense of the production.
Yes.
But I'm
There's
sorry,
a great documentary if anyone wants to know more about that.
Yeah. If the brief here is do something different, then I question Jim Carrey's choices quite a lot because. You're not doing that, Jim. If then maybe that wasn't the brief for Jim. Maybe he wasn't bothered about that.
Well,
or maybe he felt like the best thing for the movie.
I've got a quote from him if you want to hear his thoughts on the matter.
Yeah.
Let me find it. It was in my Triv, but if we're on that subject, let me just read the quote now.
Yeah, I think the rule is always if the Triv if the Triv helps the discussion we're having, like whack it in early.
Here we go. So the writer of this film, which was actually Judd Apatow, partly, we'll come to that. Not credited, we'll come to that. But basically, Apatow was tasked with making the movie darker, and basically Jim was looking to deviate from Ace Ventura into the goofy characters he'd been known for. This is the quote from Carey, right? I can't keep repeating myself. My audience is going to get bored. I can't keep making Ace Ventura. If I don't progress as a creative person, I'm going to go stale and the audience won't come anyway. Now, point 1, that is very astute and that is correct. Point 2, that is not what he achieved with this movie.
No. like not at all. There's a reason. Like if you watch that Carey family reunion skit from SNL.
Yeah.
Like the Mask is in there, Ace Ventura is in there, and Cable Guy is in there because it's not as big a jump as fucking Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
No, but I mean, and look, I'm willing to accept the stepping stone argument. You know, he made a darker movie. He still had to do the physical comedy. Because it was a comedy, and that's what people expected from him to a degree. But the movie itself is darker, therefore maybe that's his stepping stone to doing things like The Truman Show, Eternal Sunshine. You know, these movies that... Everyone's favourite movie, The Number 23, or whatever it was called. God, that movie sucked. That's one of the worst movies I ever sat through in a cinema. It's a bad movie. Anyway. So yeah, you know, I think you could argue it's a stepping stone, but more because of the movie than his performance. The performance he gives in this movie, you could pretty much, with the exception of like 2 or 3 scenes, you could pretty much pluck this performance out and stick it in like an Ace Ventura or a Mask, and it fit fine. So overall thoughts, I think, I really enjoyed it. I was very pleasantly surprised. It's not the funniest movie in the world, but it's such an engaging story, and you're very invested in the characters and the situation. And I think they do a really good job tying all the plot elements together. There are things that seem disparate that come together. There's one big one Chris already referenced, but just smaller ones too. Like, you kind of like, at one point in the movie, I was like, I'd forgotten why we were introducing his work. I was like, why do I care about his boss? I don't. Why am I seeing these scenes? These are not relevant to the plot. But it all ties in later into the movie, and it all comes together in what I thought was pretty satisfying way. So yeah, I'm a big fan of this, of how this screenplay mostly turned out, with the exception of the adjustments to the third act, which are mostly just snips, but we'll come to that. So yeah, it's I think really great film. Like, I think I recommend, like, especially if you've never seen it. I think what a delightful, like, surprise this was to see that it holds up. Like, because I was really convinced young Dan just liked it because it was different, not because it actually held up on its own merit. But I think it does. And considering Chris, with no knowledge of the content of the movie, got sucked in the way he did, I'd say if you've not seen this movie, I would even potentially argue stop listening to this podcast right now and go check it out. Before we go into
I think
full
so. And don't get me wrong, it's not going to be. It's not going to be for everyone.
No, no,
you know what I mean?
No, that's true.
And, like, you know, there is that kind of, I hate to do that usual caveat of, if X sounds interesting, check it out. But if a psychological horror that is still a Jim Carrey movie sounds in any way appealing,
and specifically a goofy Jim Carrey 90s comedy, like, specifically that.
Oh yeah.
Like,
yeah. Oh yeah. I looked it up, by the way, and there is that. Sorry, I've got to pull it back up. But I was kind of weirdly, because I wouldn't say like Jim Carrey was, as a kid, or now particularly, by any stretch my favourite actor or anything. But he's got a run where 94 to Ace Ventura, the Pet Detective, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber, Batman Forever, Ace Ventura, When Nature Calls, The Cable Guy, Liar Liar, The Truman Show, and then there's a film called Simon Birch that I've not seen.
But I've seen Simon Birch. I've forgotten all about Simon Birch. Jesus, sorry, carry on.
I as a kid, well, we'll continue the run in a sec to see how far you go. I, as a kid, watched every single one of those movies except The Cable Guy. So, like, there literally is a run of, like, classic Jim Carrey.
Yes.
Where as a kid, I missed The Cable Guy. And like I say, I think if it was promoted more like the film it is, I would have watched it.
Well, I think that's what's interesting about this movie. Is, like, I just think it's damned if it does, damned if it doesn't, because it is darker than all of those. And I think you really can't market it at a younger audience the way you might have done with an Ace Ventura or a Mask. You know what I mean? Like,
but I don't know. But I feel like, think about the poster to Liar Liar, which is literally just him in a suit, like him in the Cable Guy costume, just smiling like madly.
Right.
I just don't know if you need like the lightning and him holding the cable and like.
No, I don't disagree with you, but then you've got the issue of, like, are you then mispromoting it? Because I think this poster probably reflects the movie more than, like, just goofy Jim Carrey mugging at the camera in a Cable Guy outfit with, like, a white background, don't you think? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle, the actual answer. Because I think the actual poster we got leans to horror, and I think the actual, like a goofy Jim Carrey movie poster where it's just, like, him in front of, like, a background where he's, like, looking, you know, mugging at the camera. Those two are so different, and this movie lands, I think, almost squarely in the middle. And I don't know how you can find
that's fair.
Yeah, I think you'd actually have to find a middle ground. But that is actually probably the movie's... Certainly it was his issue in terms of its box office revenue. We'll come to that. It's not completely the bomb history has made it out to be, but it didn't do very well. It made its money back just. But I think a lot of that is to do with, like, people just didn't know what this movie was. And I think that is a problem.
So I definitely recommend. I also I want to know where your run ends. So Simon Birch, you say you've seen?
Yes, yeah. It's the one with the little kid. The kid. He's like I think he has, like, a disability, and it's like he's going through. It's like it's not even really a Jim Carrey movie, Simon Birch. It's about this kid, but Jim Carrey's in it. Anyway, carry on.
No, he's the adult / narrator. Man on the Moon, obviously you've seen.
Yep.
Me, Myself, and Irene.
Yep.
I assume you saw.
Absolutely.
How the Grinch Stole Christmas.
Yep.
So this is where we might get into difficulties. The Majestic.
Oh no, there you go. I haven't seen that one.
Yeah, there you go.
What's The Majestic? Do I even know that one?
It's an American romantic drama film produced by Frank Darabont.
Let's have a look. Oh, Frank Darabont. Oh, shit. No, I haven't seen this. Looks fun. Looks potentially quite good. Frank Darabont of Shawshank fame. Ooh.
Apparently, according to the Wikipedia, this film is like actually a departure from what he usually does or did at that time.
Right, but he'd already done Man at the Moon at this point, though, right? You just said.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. Anyway, right. Let's So in terms of overall thoughts, definitely give it a go. In terms of spoilery stuff, let's break down some of the details of this movie because so much of this movie is completely unhinged. Where do we even start with the details of this movie? Well, let's start with some of the subtleties of the opening act of the movie. I was impressed at its restraint from a script perspective, even if Carey's performance starts at a 10 and leaves him nowhere to go. The subtleties of the script in terms of like how it brings them together is actually pretty good. Like that initial, I should take you to the satellite sometime. He's like, yeah, we should do that sometime. Well, how about tomorrow? And he's like all that stuff's really fun. And then at the end, he's like, my friends call me Chip. And then Matthew Broderick just goes, cool, well, bye. And then leaves and doesn't call him Chip. Like it's just little moments like that I really enjoy.
I really liked when he's setting up, like, seeing him, and there's a sort of back and forth where Broderick doesn't... What is Broderick's character's called, by the way?
He's called Stephen, and I only know this because in my notes there's always that debate of PH or V every time I'm typing his name in my notes.
I like Stephen's, weighing, and he's like, oh, okay, and eventually it gets settled, and Jim Carrey's, the cable guy, Chip, just goes, okay, then I'll see you at 6:30, and just, like, runs away.
Yeah, like a child.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's great.
Did you think, here's a slightly bigger question, but interesting discussion point, because I suppose you won't be able to remember, but I'm watching the film, right, and especially, like, the party scene where Broderick gets into it and sleeps with that woman, and the scene where Jack Black is like, oh, what are you going to do? Take the cable guy, and sort of jealous and moaning at him. I'm watching the film going, is this going to a place where Stephen becomes the cable guy? Where Stephen transforms from this mild-mannered guy who wants his partner back to basically like Cable Guy Part 2. I'm glad it didn't go down that route. I think that's a less interesting movie and a harder movie to get yourself out of.
Yes.
But yeah, there were points where I was like, is that where this is going?
Yeah, he's gonna like weird him up. Because they even have the line. The Chip says to Rick, the Jack Black character, he says like, he's changing, man. He's like, he's changing. You're gonna have to accept it. He's doing that whole shtick. I guess, yeah. I mean, it probably didn't occur to me as a kid, and obviously on subsequent viewings, if you know where it's going, you're not likely to ponder the possibilities.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to ever know. But I could, if someone showed me the first act of this movie and asked me to just plot out, 5 possible directions for the movie going, I presume that would be, one of them for sure. Like the idea that he sort of ruins his life by sort of making him as weird as he is, and then they're lonely, and they're sort of he's ruined his life so much. All that's left is for him to hang out with him. Like for Steve to hang out with Chip, because the only person who's like accepting him now, he sort of brought him into his world, is Chip, and that becomes almost like an abusive relationship. I think there's an episode, I think, I could be wrong, but I feel like that might be an episode of Inside Number 9 that tackles a similar idea, actually.
Yes. Who?
It's the homeless guy one.
Yeah.
It's got a really messed up ending.
Yeah, I was going to say, and then there's a... Yeah.
So I don't think you're wrong to have to have wondered that. I think the seeds are there. If they'd wanted to go that direction, there's definitely a version of this movie that could have gone that direction. I think considering its original position as a comedy, a buddy comedy, that then got sort of turned into a darker movie at a later point, I don't think that was ever on the cards, realistically, but I think just looking at the finished product, that's definitely a route they could have taken, for sure.
Yeah, oh yeah, I don't think that was the plan. I just thought it was interesting, like how it looks like it might go that way.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think as well, like it's interesting because I can't decide. There are always scenes in this movie where I can't decide if it's a step too far. But every time I think that, then there's another scene that I'm like, no, that's definitely a step too far. Like showing up, like the movie doesn't really ever address that it's so obviously weird that Chip shows up to the basketball game. Like, that's insane. That's the biggest red flag early in the movie, right? Because he's like, oh, you guys play here too? It's like, he's clearly followed you here, dude. Like, that's creepy. That's like, Steven, get out, man. This is the house whispering get out in the first act. You better move the fuck out. to keep the horror analogies going. The signs are there, and he barrels on.
For me, that was... For me, it's less about Stephen as it is about the people around him in that last half an hour. The fact that his girlfriend, like, sort of ends up trusting the cable guy. The fact that the cable guy is round his family's house. Like, the fact that she doesn't... The fact that a man who she, regardless of their current status, has loved and has cared about. The fact that she seemingly isn't even entertaining the idea that he may be right about this guy who's obviously overtly fairly unhinged is mad. Like, do you know what I mean? The fact that, like, could Stephen not have gone, your partner got beaten up? Like, well, I suppose he didn't know it was, but you know what I mean? Like, it just seems that last half an hour, the fact that he's in prison and then he's out of prison, that's when for me it becomes very like beyond the realm in terms of, so it's less, I never felt it with Stephen, but I felt it with like his family and her towards the end. I think
they get away with it with the family because he is very good. Like in that scene, very briefly, just that scene where he goes to the house and Chip is with his family and has the family meal and is playing parlor games after the meal. That scene is masterfully written, right? There is never a red flag that the family witness. It's so perfectly written to make Stephen look insane and like he's being really rude to this delightful life of the party guy. Right? Like that's it's a masterpiece of writing, and it's really frustrating to watch on purpose because Stephen's right. You and Stephen are the only people, or I guess and Chip, that know he's correct. And it's like watching everyone, and his behavior makes so much sense because he's frustrated like you're frustrated. So when he lashes out at Chip and everyone's looking at him like he's insane, you fully feel it. It's perfect. I love that scene. I don't think that scene is... No notes. Perfect. I think you're right with the Robin stuff. There are definitely moments when Robin should have figured this out sooner, or people like to believe. But at that point, we're in that latter half of the movie where we're full-on mask off. The plot is now... The movie shifts at that scene in the rain. When Stephen finally says to Chip, I don't want you in my life anymore. I don't have any room for any more friends. I do not want to be your friend. That moment onwards, it's like all bets are off. Movie just goes insane, right? So I expect a certain amount of that from that point on. So the Robin stuff that follows that, even though you're right, there's definitely a question to be asked about, like, she should probably have figured this out quicker than she has. There's numerous red flags that were very visible to her in the way the script is written that she should have absolutely picked up on. So from a believability standpoint, you're right. We've revealed there is really a ghost in the house in the Paranormal Activity movie at that point, and at that point on all bets are off. Anything can happen because it's just we're just in that we've sort of crossed that threshold into the madness. So the reason I picked out the basketball one is because I always think of those like early moments when we're still supposed to be subtle. We're building up to madness and that sort of stuff happening. And that is such an early red flag when he's been weird, but not stalkery before that point. Him showing up at the basketball thing, for me, was like, I think we maybe... If the movie is an arc, if we're plotting it on a graph, and it's a slow, gradual build to the madness, to like full-on mask off Jim Carey just being openly insane, doing things to destroy his life, all that stuff. But we're starting at first you think maybe he might be okay, but there's some weird red flags, and those build. that's a very big red flag very early that sort of doesn't follow the smooth curve of that arc, if that makes sense. It's like, that's like a scene that almost should be like 2 scenes later, if that makes sense. Like, because I think showing up is such an obviously stalkery move. And I feel like it makes Steven look stupid. A little bit, just a tiny bit. But I do agree with you. There's multiple moments like that throughout the movie. I'm just more accepting of it, I think, towards the end, once we've already let the character off the leash, because he's not trying to disguise it anymore. Steven already knows that he's unhinged and stalking and all that stuff, so there's no reason for the cable guy to be subtle anymore. Whereas at the beginning he's trying to be, and he's that's very badly done. Like, just showing up and be like, oh, you guys play basketball here too? Like, we've never seen you here before, dude. You have clearly followed Steven here. Like, by every
and you also
logical metric.
Coincidentally want to play the game we're playing.
Yeah, you've shown up with basketballs in the basketball gear. Like, come on, buddy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it is.
We know. So yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. But like, I think generally speaking, though, the movie's reasonably well balanced in terms of like the escalation. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Like the medieval times one is another good example, like the family sequence, where it's like, it's just on the line, where it's like, is this all in good fun, or is this guy actually insane and trying to kill him? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a really, really fine line the movie walks the whole way through, and I think mostly it works. Not always, but it's generally speaking pretty good. Because that medieval time scene, you go a dial up or down on that, and it doesn't function, I don't think. You go too far, then you're immediately like, well, Steven should be leaving now, never talking to this guy again. This should be the cutoff point. But you dial it down too much, it's not menacing enough to create tension. So you're like, ugh.
Yeah, I love the way you're like, that should be the cutoff point. Like, I don't know, Dan. Like, if someone broke into my home, changed my stereo system, gave me a karaoke machine, a new TV, I'd be fairly suspicious at that point, personally.
I don't know what you're talking about,
I'll
Chris.
be honest with you. I'm not sure how good a TV setup would have to be for me to just excuse the fact that they'd broken in.
You don't want a comical Doc Brown-sized TV and sound system?
No, I don't want someone breaking into my house to put it in, Dan. It's
not worth it for the giant sound system?
Because actually, if you think about it, what makes that even funnier is that later on they make such a big deal with him locking the door. Like, locks don't seem to be a problem for this guy.
But I think that's such a good point. That's funny. I think it's super interesting, like, because I think you're right. This is the thing, is like, there are so many like moments in this movie where you're like, that should and could be the breaking point. Yeah, you're right. That is one of them. I do think though that like the one they pick to be the initial break point, which is the prostitute thing, that's because the second time when they have the conversation in the rain, that's more like a I'm going to try and let him down gently because I did it hard and he's not gone out of my life. So now I'm going to try and be like, it's not you, it's me. I just don't need room for friends right now. It's like a second attempt. But he's already decided he's done with Chip after the party. The eggs. The discovering he just slept with a prostitute over eggs scene. And I don't mean he slept with a prostitute on top of a pile of eggs. I mean he's having a meal, they're eating eggs when he discovers this. The conversation occurs over eggs. So yeah, I think that's I think if we plot out the movie's points, all of the insane things the cable guy does and their escalating chaos, if you were to say which is the breaking point, I mean, I'm probably putting a pin in that one. And going, yeah, that's probably the point. He was like, nah, I'm done with you.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I was surprised as how... Because you can tell that as well by the fact that he doesn't just... The minute... Because Chip, at least initially, gets his girlfriend back for him. Like, Chip is the reason he has the thing he's looked for the whole movie. But he still doesn't then go, oh, okay, yeah, well, in that case, we'll be friends. Thank you, buddy. Like, he's still like, no, we're done.
Right. Because, I mean, and I think that is it's another good little piece of character work for Steven, because it's like, okay, he does have a breaking point. He's not going to be a complete pushover all the time. in this situation. Do you know what I mean? Like he has a line too, you know? Yeah, I really liked it. So yeah, I think that generally speaking, it functions really well. And then we have, because we also have that, there's a scene between those two, right? Or maybe it's earlier in the movie. I can't remember its exact placement. There's a really interesting scene where Matthew Broderick's character sits down with, so Steven sits down with Robin to watch a movie, which was a suggestion of the cable guy. And he cuts off the cable so he can't do it. And like, that's right before medieval times. That's how he bullies him into medieval times. That's another one of those like red flag moments. Because it's like, you shouldn't have to like coerce your friends into spending time with you by cutting off their cable.
He also shouldn't be there right away. Like, he doesn't. I don't think he even finishes the call and the door knocks.
Yeah, the call doesn't connect and then the door knocks. He's like, something wrong with your cable? You know, it's good. It's a good scene. That scene actually has one of my favourite jokes in it, which is the cable, when he fixes it, he just goes over to a fuse box, flicks a switch, and then he comes back over and he's like, oh, what was the cut cord for? And he's like, dramatic effect. That's such a good joke. That's like one of my favorite jokes in the whole movie. It's perfectly delivered. It's brilliantly written. It's mwah, yes. Let's talk about the final act then. Let's talk about some of the stuff in the final act, because I think there's a lot going on in that final act. There's like a dream sequence. There's the thing where he's leaving the car park and all the cars are going off. Like, it really does shift into horror. And then almost like a superhero movie at the end where Matthew Broderick goes to save the girlfriend who's tied up at a landmark. You know, it's like a Spider-Man movie in the end. How did you feel? Like, let's get more into some of the stuff that you weren't fond of in the third act, because I think that was a big point in the when we were doing the overview. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on some of those moments.
But I don't even know if not fond of is fair. I just didn't enjoy it as much as the first act. And I don't. To be honest with you, it's not even the stuff at the very end. Like, because you know, once you're there in terms of it becoming a superhero movie. And I love how they connected it to the case.
Yes.
Like, as he's falling and like we're seeing the verdict, and I'm like, oh, we know where this is going, and that's great. And like the scene, and I wish they did more scenes of it. I wanted more. You know, it's almost exactly the end of the Truman Show. The scene where they don't find out, and one guy just goes, okay, and picks up a book.
Yeah.
Like, I really wanted more of that. Like, I wanted it to be like, you know how in the Truman Show, the whole movie's been about everyone being obsessed and watching this show, and when it's over, that everyone's just like, what else is on? Like, just goes about with their lives. Like, I wanted everyone to just not give a shit actually about the result of this case.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really liked all of that. I think it was very specifically like noticing the pace and being like, what the fuck, of like the prison scenes and like the family game scene, which, like you say, is an excellent scene. I agree with everything you said about the scene, but that's when I was really like, oh, we have like turned the dial up to 11. Like,
yeah, and I think it's just for some context, in case anyone's decided to listen to this without having seen the movie, we should clarify what the case is. Actually, it's just occurred to me very quickly. The whole way through the movie, there's a murder trial happening that's sort of gripping the nation between two child stars, brothers, twins, where one murdered the other, or at least that is the accusation. He's on trial for the murder of his own brother, and then there's that the much debated 911 call, where people speculate that is not Ben Stiller's voice, but Jim Carey's voice, causing speculation that maybe Chip had, you know, with his TV obsession, at some point stalked and befriended these brothers, and had actually ended up killing one and, you know, and framing the other, which is why the line at the opening of the movie where he goes, "I hope the bastard fries for that," or whatever, is like, now it's never confirmed. The movie doesn't outright do that, but the movie ends with this brilliant thing where the trial, the guilty or not guilty plea is about to be read when the cable guy throws himself off the satellite and breaks it and takes down everyone's TV, so they don't get to find out the result, and they all just sort of, well, at least Kyle Gass's character just carries on. We didn't give context for that, so I just wanted to add that very quickly.
Yeah, and I think that's the play of like, how is this going to link in? Is very clever, because I'm sat there going, mate, were they actually triplets? Jim Carrey was like a third child, or like, because there's this big mystery around who Chip actually is and what his real identity is. So you do definitely think like they're going to link those more overtly, and I like that Easter egg of. I didn't think it necessarily when I watched it the first time, but I like that Easter egg of maybe that's Jim Carrey's voice and he was involved as well.
The first sentence really does sound like Jim Carrey's voice, but the second sentence sounds a little more stiller. And I almost think they fucked with us by having them both deliver the line and then like picked like the two of them like one into the other. Like, I don't know. I'm not certain, but they've definitely done some shenanigans there, I think, because it really does sound like Jim Carrey at the beginning of that call. Like, very much so, but it sort of drifts into stiller. So yeah, I think they've done enough to make that like ambiguous. Like, we'll never know the truth of that. But yeah, I think they've almost gone for a Joker-esque thing here, where, like, you know, every time he tells a story, you're sort of wondering if it's true, which is actually why one of the small scenes I just didn't care for in the movie was the actual flashback. Deeply unneeded, confirmed too much about the character's past that I could have got from his speech at the end the same effect. Do you know what I mean? I didn't need a scene to sort of set it up earlier in the movie, because the premise, for those who don't remember, there's a scene earlier in the movie where he has a little flashback, and basically his mother called the TV, the babysitter, and she would just go out night after night, leaving her son in front of it, which is why the movie posits might be why he's sort of not socially normal, because he didn't interact with other people very much as a kid. His whole world was television. That's all he did, was he sat and watched TV, and it sort of had an effect on his ability to socialize normally, which has led to the stalking and the weird behaviors and things he thinks is normal but is definitely not. And I think, you know, there's a big speech at the end of the movie where he's doing that, and I think if that scene hadn't existed, then at the end of the movie I'm watching that speech going, how much of this is bullshit? Like, I'm wondering if he's doing another bit, another lie. Sort of, you know, that it's like the Joker and that whole, you know, you know how I got these scars, you know, that whole thing. Like, you know, and he tells a different story every time. I kind of liked the idea that Chip, the man of 1,000 different identities and pseudonyms, has different backstories too. That's more interesting to me, and I don't love that we confirmed at least one element of his backstory. I think it would have been nicer if it had just been left open. I don't know. How did you feel about that?
I didn't think much of it. I didn't mind it. Like, yeah, I suppose it made me go, oh, maybe he's not, you know, connected as a brother.
Right.
Twins. But yeah, I didn't mind there being an explanation. At all. If anything, like, I was a little bit like, well, you know, that doesn't mean he's necessarily going to turn out that way. You know, you and I were hardly abandoned to watch television by our parents, but we certainly watched a lot of it.
Yes, we did.
I remember getting really stroppy one half term because the Disney Channel was showing a Boy Meets World marathon every single day, and my mum was like, very much like, no, you need to go out and do stuff. Like, you can't just sit here and watch Boy Meets World all holiday. But I'd have been, Dan, very happy to sit there and watch Boy Meets World all holiday.
I would have absolutely been allowed. My parents didn't give a shit where I went or what I did.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
As I said it, I'll be honest with you, peek behind the curtain, as I said it, I was like, I can't necessarily vouch for Dan's parents there, but I'll take a punt and say they didn't do that.
Yeah, not as interested in encouraging, but if I was silent and out of the way, they were happy. I think that was mostly... That was mostly the goal. Is he outside or is he in front of the TV? It doesn't matter. Yeah, so talking about someone who's had their entire personality warped by watching too much TV as a child. Anyway, Yeah, so I think in general, like the from a filmmaking perspective, it's really interesting. So this was directed by Ben Stiller, and I think he does a good job. I think it's shot interestingly. I think it's like the one thing I would say for this movie that really does actually, one of the things that separates it from the comedy it was originally going to be is the sort of photography of the movie, the way it's shot, the colors, the angles that are chosen. It's often shot from interesting perspectives. It's often shot in very dark places. It's got a dark tone that comes not from the words but from the visuals. And I think, for such a young director at that point, I don't know how much he directed. I think he'd only directed one other movie Stiller at that point. Was it Heavyweights? I think. So like, he was pretty new to the directing game, and I think it's pretty impressive, really, what he managed to achieve. Because I think if you put this script as it is, word for word, on screen into a sort of a shooting script, I don't know if it reads anywhere near as menacing as this. And I think it's partly the way he directed the performances, because I do think, obviously, Jim Carey is menacing in much of the movie, and that will have been not just part to his own talent, obviously, but partly the director, giving him, working with him, I should say, like on and sort of refining that performance to what it needed to be. I know a lot of scenes in this movie were shot twice, once more subtle and comedic, and once more like overtly menacing, and then they were able to use footage from all different takes to craft the final performance. So actually, some of Jim Carrey's performance in this movie will have sort of come together in the edit. Which moment do we choose to have the more menacing beat in, this one or this one? You can mess around with that if you've got that sort of optionality, if you've sort of shot the movie that way. So that's a really smart choice. My favorite shot in the whole movie is just the two of them coming together head to head in the rain. It's just a two shot, like it's it's just head side on, like the two of them coming together in the rain in the dark. It's brilliantly lit, though. It's really well done, and it's one of the more dramatic scenes in the movie. And then they cut to these like close-ups where you can see the water just pouring off their faces as the moment intensifies. I don't know. It's just really well done. The only shot in the whole movie I don't like is when we first are introduced to the satellite. There are two shots that I don't like for different reasons. The first is the establishing shot of the satellite, because unfortunately the satellite is established to be much bigger than the set they then use for the satellite. So the scale is all wrong. The initial glimpse of the satellite makes it look like it's like, 20 stories tall. But then when they're in it, it's like a fifth of that scale. It's like so much smaller, and that broke my brain from the realism perspective. And then the other one is when they wanted the shot of him on the edge of the satellite delivering his dialogue, but they clearly couldn't get that shot for whatever logistical reason, because either the satellite they shot as the exterior, as the sort of establishing shot, you couldn't actually get on it, and the set wasn't like positioned in a way where you could get that angle that they wanted. So they just like composited it onto the establishing shot, and it looks so obscenely fake. Like it just looks like they cut Jim Carrey out of one shot, pasted him into another. And there's another visual effect in this movie that's way more seamless that I didn't know about until I read the trivia. So it's just a shame that this one didn't quite land, because otherwise the movie would be really seamless. And again, credit to them, it mostly works, but dear Lord, that shot looks fucking dreadful. I cringed when I saw it. It's bad. It's really bad. Yeah. Anyway. How did you feel? Do you have any thoughts on the visuals while we're on the subject?
No, just that they were really effective, and that kind of grungy overtone to the whole movie is very effective. I think it almost looks like you're watching it on a cable channel you shouldn't have or something. Like, yeah, I thought that was very. If you think about like. This is going to sound so weird, but like, if you, and maybe it's different for people in America, but whenever I heard, like, our experience of cable was through it being referenced on TV shows, like, The Simpsons and stuff like that. And cable being this thing that you could potentially take illegally, and then you got access to more channels, including channels you shouldn't. Like, if you think about, like, and also if you think about, like, HBO's visual logo and stuff like that. Like, if cable was a color, if my impression of cable in the 90s was a color, that color would be the aesthetic that runs through this movie. Does that make sense?
It does. I think it's interesting actually, because we had cable in the UK. We had Sky, and like Sky was cable. And I think what was really funny about the way Sky worked is you could pay the cable installer money to get the movie channels for free, exactly like in this movie. And I know this because my auntie did it, and my favorite thing ever was to go around to her house because you could watch whatever movie you wanted. And I mean any movie. It was amazing. Like the new movie that was out, where you'd go to Sky and you'd pay like a couple of quid to like watch it. Like you get access to it for 24 hours or whatever. It would just play on that channel on loop. You'd have access to it for 24 hours. That just worked without having to pay. So I could just watch any movie. It was so good.
Oh, wow.
And she had done exactly what they did in this movie. She had paid the installer like a certain amount of money, and he'd just set it up. It was great. He'd unlocked it somehow. I don't know how that worked physically.
I guess
we definitely had an equivalent to that in the UK.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I guess just in my head, cable is cables and Sky is a big Sky dish, so I just don't think of. But you're right, it's absolutely the equivalent. Yeah.
So it's funny you should mention the movie grungy, because if my memory serves me, the soundtrack for this movie was a really grungy soundtrack. Like it had a lot of like grunge acts on it, and it came out about 6 months after grunge completely died. So I think just like the film itself, very poorly timed.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So I have a question about the dream sequence, because dream sequences are usually not a thing you're a fan of. This one's pretty unintrusive, I feel like, but it is there. And I was curious as to, and it is in the third act, and I wonder if maybe that's another thing that's sort of like part of the enjoyed the third act a little less than the other two. Does the dream sequence play into that at all? How did you feel about that?
No, I found it pretty unintrusive, if I'm honest. It's fairly quick. It's fairly adamant right away that it is a dream sequence.
Yes, it's not trying to trick you.
Also, like, the defense of these things is often... and I dislike them the most when I feel like they're meaningless. And I think actually that visual of him running from a constant corridor, running down a constant corridor and being chased, and he can't reach an end point because the corridor just keeps extending. I think that's actually really effective in terms of a visual representation of the character's state at that point, and a visual representation because fundamentally the character is in a situation that they just don't know how to get out of, and that metaphor of running down an endless corridor for that is effective and is understandable, Yeah,
and I think it's interesting because I think running down an endless corridor is kind of like been used a number of times. It's almost a trope, for dream sequences. But you're right. I think in this example, it's particularly effective because it is a good gauge of where he's at mentally. I agree with you. I think it's another opportunity for Ben Stiller to flex some more interesting visuals. I always like the shots through the keyhole in this movie. I think they're good. I think it's sort of because he's used to use sort of a fisheye lens, and that's always fun. The giving Jim Carrey's Chip character like the glowy eyes, sort of making him more demonic than he already is. Like just a really small touch makes a big difference. The sort of overly saturated blue lighting as well gives it a really interesting sort of dreamlike vibe. I think it's a pretty well done one. I've always held the opinion that Ben Stiller is probably a little up himself, but he is very talented. And I very rarely see a thing Ben Stiller's worked on where I've said that's bad. And I kind of wish he was worse at his job so I could fully just like be like, I don't like that guy. Because whenever I've seen him in interviews and stuff, I've never really gotten a good vibe from him. It's the same vibe I had from James Corden before I outright knew James Corden was a terrible person. I've just got a sense about it, and I've always had that with Stiller. But yeah, it's just one of those things. But I just cannot deny his talent here, and shocking for such a young director. Although sometimes I find young directors are way more willing to just be like, let's try it, and that can lead to this sort of thing. So sometimes being the young director is actually the superpower. You know what I mean? Because you've just got you don't know you don't know how it's supposed to be done. You don't know the rules to know you're breaking them. Do you know what I mean? And he definitely did some interesting stuff with this film. Again, I'm not suggesting it's an art film or anything in the way it's shot. It's mostly fundamentally shot straight, but yeah, there's definitely some interesting choices throughout.
His run as a director, I mean, I don't particularly like Zoolander, but it was a huge hit, very popular. Obviously, Tropic Thunder was huge as well. Secret Life of Walter Mitty is meant to be very good.
Great.
Like,
I genuinely, I love that movie. Yeah.
And obviously Severance, which is, one of our favourite shows of the last decade. So, you can't... I think people can say what they want about his talent as an actor. I think his talent as a director is much harder to argue against.
Yeah, I'd agree. And particularly because with Severance, it's not just that it's like a good show. It's specifically a really well-directed show. Visually. It's the language of the cinema that it uses is terrific, and a big part of why it's so powerful, that show, and its tone works so well. So it's, you absolutely can't... You absolutely can't deny that one. It's so good. It's so good. I'm only just realizing that he was on board, did you say Tropic Thunder as a director?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he directed Tropic Thunder.
Huh. Didn't know that.
I might be wrong. Hold on.
Yeah, looks like you did. Looks like you did.
Yeah.
Yeah, didn't know that. I was thinking of like Secret Life and like Zoolander this, and obviously I do always love Heat Vision and Jack. If anyone's ever seen that, it's an amazing pilot. It was a Dan Harmon script. And it was Jack Black playing a character. It was like a play on Knight Rider, like a parody of Knight Rider, Heat Vision and Jack. And it was a guy on a motorbike that talked, I think. I've not seen it in years and years, but it was so much fun. Anyway, bananas thing that exists in the world. Cool, yeah. So, the ending. We should talk very briefly about the very ending. How did you? I mean, I love. For those who don't remember, you're gonna be okay, buddy. Really? Do you mean it? Do I mean what? Am I your buddy? Yeah, sure you are. And then just the face shifting, like the next victim in his eye line. Menacing as hell. So good. Such a great choice.
It's a great choice, a great horror movie ending. And as we've said at this point, it kind of is, it is the ghost is there, or the endless fights with the slasher at the end of Halloween or whatever.
Yeah.
It is that movie at the end, and so that giving it that ending I thought was great, and also weirdly satisfying for the Stephen character, because you genuinely feel he's going to be left alone by him.
Yes, that's such a good point. Because otherwise you wouldn't believe it, because he's alive. You'd be like, this guy's just coming back in a month. Yes, you're right. Yeah. You're absolutely right. That's so clever. But it also does kind of make, and I think it's really interesting as well, just from a character arc perspective, because the movie kind of or at least Chip wants you to believe that he doesn't think he's capable of letting Stephen go. So when he leaps off the thing, what he's telling us is happening is he's letting himself go so he can't be a problem for anyone anymore, because he realizes he's hurt people, is kind of the implication. But then he survives that and immediately moves on to the next person, and it makes me think, oh, that was bullshit then, right? Like, that was just an act because he'd been caught. Like, it had come to its natural conclusion and he had no way out other than to do that. But that was a lie. He didn't feel that way at all, because if he'd felt that way, he wouldn't be immediately back on the stalking horse. And I think he is. This is metaphorically, this is the end of a movie with a monster where they kill the monster and then we reveal the monster had laid an egg, and the last shot of the movie is the egg cracking. That's what that scene is.
Yeah, but I'm going to try and make it work, Dan.
Do it.
Could you not argue that one of the reasons he feels he can't let Stephen go is because he feels he's not going to find another friend, and he's not going to be able to find another friend, and then the buddy at the end, it makes him think that he can.
Yeah, for sure. But that's what I love about it, is it's so ambiguous. There are a few different ways you could read it, for sure. The buddy at the end makes me wonder if the speech was bullshit, but I don't know the speech was bullshit. And you're right, another interpretation of it very easily could be that he genuinely did feel like he was done there and he was going to give himself up, and it just wasn't worth it because he realized he'd made his friend's life worse and everyone's life worse, and he was going to let himself go. Maybe that was legit, and maybe you're right. Maybe it was the buddy that brought him back out of it. Or maybe it was all horseshit, and he was just moving on to the next one. That's what I love about the character arc for. I say character arc with a character like this. There's never an arc because you don't really know what their psychological state is, and that's what's interesting about this movie. We normally review a movie, and one of the first things we talk about as people who study screenwriting is the character arcs. We always talk about it when every movie we review. The arcs in this movie are non-existent to a degree because the point is you're not really supposed to know where he's at. You're supposed to be nervous about him and feel tense about him and his behaviors the entirety of the movie. So the movie can't communicate to you where he's at. The only character that we can have on an arc is Matthew Broderick's character, and his arc is, this guy seems weird, it's getting worse, it's getting worse, it's getting worse, I need him out of my life is crumbling, and I fixed it. It's a very practical character arc for him. So there's not much really to chew on there, because he's sort of a tool for us to experience that tension. You know what I mean? Like we talked about at the party.
Do you think, speaking of arcs and characters, do you think it could be argued that Leslie Mann's character, and she's brilliant in it.
Yes.
Leslie Mann's always brilliant. I really like Leslie Mann as an actress. Do you think it could be argued that her character is written fairly inconsistently and not like that brilliantly throughout the movie?
That was going to be my next point. Yeah. She's, her at the end just being like, I love you, out of nowhere for no reason, when 2 scenes ago she was like, I don't like you, and I think that Chip guy's got a point, you're going off the deep end. She's seen, I guess Chip's kidnapped her at that point, is that... But also, how did she... if this is one of those moments, how did he get her out there? Because we cut to her at the satellite, and she's like, I'm gonna go, and she's scared of Chip, right? What? When did she become afraid of Chip? Because she voluntarily got in the van. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, but I think when he's fucking ranting and giving soliloquies in the rain, Dan. If I'm like to you, let's go hang out at this nature spot I know.
Yeah.
You'll be like, oh yeah, I'm getting in the van. Hopefully there'll be some birds.
Yeah.
And we get there and it's fucking pouring with rain, and it's a big fucking satellite dish, and I'm just like, you see, the thing is, Dan, you're probably gonna go, okay, this is taking a turn, isn't it?
Well, so two points to that. First of all, in the scenario you cooked up, the location is not the location you promised me, so that's upsetting. Whereas I feel like Robin knew she was going to the big satellite, so that's one thing that doesn't quite gel between those. You're right, it is alarming if someone tells you they're taking you to one place and then takes you somewhere else. But I feel like Robin knew where she was going, number one. But number two, it's the same speech he gave Matthew Broderick an hour earlier, and Matthew Broderick became mates with him.
No, there's way more intensity, and it's pissing it down and all that sort of stuff.
This is my point.
I think the problem
he's delivering it louder, but it's raining. That's the difference. That's when she clocks on that he's not well.
Yes.
When a scene
in the rain, Dan?
When a scene ago she was fine with him and thought he was great and funny.
No, I think his behaviour is really... And also, at first, she's like, okay, I think we should go now. She's only really scared when he's, got her fucking tied up.
Yeah,
Sorry,
which, by the way...
Which,
by the way, I don't think... We don't see that happen, do we? We just cut away and cut back, and the Green Goblin has Mary Jane hanging from the bridge. Is that what happens? It just sort of happened off screen?
Yeah. I have another sort of question about this, because I think also her sort of arc or coming back round to Stephen is fairly easily solved in and you've got to slightly I can't remember. Is a reason particularly given for them breaking up or spending time apart or something?
He was moving
like,
too
in the
fast and
film?
he was smothering her. So she said. So he describes it at the beginning of the movie as he asked her to marry him, and she was like, "This is just too much, too fast. Like it's like it feels like you're pushing me too hard. You're sort of in my grill too much. We need some space, I think, and that's sort of the setup for their situation."
Yeah, because I think maybe, like, if it was you never take action, but it's slightly hard because he then takes action a lot in terms of her throughout the movie. You know, he's constantly chasing her, he's trying to have dinner with her, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But if it was you never take action, or you say you care but you never find a way to show me, then him showing up and saving her at the end makes sense. Equally, if the implication is he's potentially a bit schlobby at the beginning, that equally makes sense of work being like, it's all on you got to show up this time, etc. Like, so yeah, I just don't know if you could have. That's not the answer. It needs refining and work because, like I say, he's fairly proactive with her throughout the movie. But
I think him being proactive
world...
with her is the problem, though, right? Because she says to him, she says to him,
"No, I'm just trying to link it to the. I'm just trying to link
it
to the. I'm basically saying, there's a world where you can try and make him turning up to save her reflect something."
I agree, but I think the problem is for the rest of the movie, I like the way their relationship almost a little bit echoes what's happening with Chip, like. He was too much for, like, he was going too fast, making it too big too soon. Proposing was not necessary. She wanted some space, and he's not giving her that space. And that's like, because even the movie opens up with Rick, his friend, being like, "Don't call Robin." He's like, "I won't." And then what does he immediately do? He hangs up with Rick and he dials Robin. It's the first thing he does. So I think there's a parallel drawn. It's not very clear. The script could probably do more work to make this like really neat. But there's a parallel drawn throughout the movie where almost Steven is learning to give people a bit more space because he's not getting any space from Chip. But I think in terms of why she turns her at the end, the problem is you then create a situation where him going to get her creates a problem because then that is arguably him putting himself into her life again, but also she needs help in that moment. So it's like, I don't know, you're right, it's a conundrum, but I think if you change the nature of the relationship, you lose that thematic link, and I think that would be unfortunate. I think I would rather have an ending where I'm like, it's a bit weird, she's just suddenly like, "I love you" in the last minute of the movie. Because he could always just go, "Well, he saved her. He saved her life. Yeah, she feels that way." Whereas if you change the other thing to make the ending more thematic, then you lose the parallel between the two characters. And I think that's quite a good element of the movie, even if it's not as overt, if it's a subtextual thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it does. And I think it is about more than saving her life. It's also, oh, you were telling the truth. Like,
right.
I thought you were crazy and I've dismissed you and I've criticised you, but clearly you were telling the truth about this guy. Okay.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah. I feel like there was one other thing I wanted to ask you about before we moved on to Trip. I wanted to just make a note. Janine Garofalo is in this movie. She has a very small role. She's the waitress at Medieval Times, and she's one of the best things in the movie. Every second she was on screen, I was laughing. It's so funny. It's so funny. More movies with Janine Garofalo in, please.
On that, what did you think of Jack Black's character? I thought, like, very kind of served a purpose to the story, but I thought Jack Black did a good job. And also, second question, the Owen Wilson scene. Like, is that too far? Is it fine? What are your thoughts on both of those? That's quite violent horror early on, isn't it?
Yeah, so Jack Black's scene is very, early Jack Black, and he was always, like, this sort of, like, the rock friend that was, like, a bit, like, cool, but, like, distant. Like, that. He played a lot of roles similar to that. If he wasn't playing that role, he was playing a bully. It's one or the other. So that fits Jack Black's early career to a T before he found his sort of more lovable characters that he became known for. So yeah, it works well. I think it's a good character to have in the movie. It's nice to have, because we see how Chip destroys every aspect of Steven's life slowly, and it sort of represents those toxic relationships that do that, where the partner becomes controlling and ends up hurting your relationship with your friends and ends up hurting sort of relationships at work and then slowly sort of seeps into every element of your life. And Chip does that in a much more literal, practical way here. But obviously Rick is a good example of that. Jack Black's character. He's like one of those things, one of those ties that Chip is able to sever through his behaviors. And I think that's just really well executed. He has a perfect position in the story, and he does exactly what he needs to do. The Owen Wilson character, I am very conflicted on, because what happens to him is absolutely savage, and I think the movie wants me to go, well, he was a bit of a dickhead on that date. He kept complaining. He kept complaining the chicken wasn't ready yet. He asked if the eggs had hatched. He was very rude to the staff, and he was very rude to the staff. I'm not sure that equates to getting his head kicked in to the point of hospitalization from Jim Carrey, if I'm being honest. It's not an equivalency, I don't think, that makes sense to me. And I know what the movie's trying to do. The movie, in just a short space of time, makes him just the worst human being on this date. Like, he asks her a question about herself, and then just as she starts answering, decides he wants to go to the toilet. Like, it's brilliantly done. It's just make me hate a character 101, and Owen Wilson delivers it perfectly. I just don't know if it's quite enough to justify what then happens. But I guess we're not really completely justifying it. We just want to justify it enough, because obviously we do want to also position Chip as a villainous character, so I guess it does that too. But yeah, Owen Wilson's great in the role. It's an interesting character, though.
Yeah, for sure. It's very it's kind of Owen Wilson doing a lot of what he did in his early career. Do you know what I mean? It's obviously it's more ramped up, but it's he's the irritating character in Meet the Parents, for example. You know what I mean? He's the irritating ex-boyfriend and smarmy and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, and the fight scene was incredibly Jim Carrey, like you said earlier, like with him, yelling the stuff and doing impressions as he's beating him up and stuff like that. Yeah. Cool. Is it time, Dan? Are we there? Are we ready?
Should we do it overall? Look, it's a fun film. I think it goes in some directions you might not expect. If you've gotten this far, you already now know the entire plot of the movie. So probably if you've never seen it, I don't know if you get anything out of it now. You know where it's going, but I do still recommend this film. I think it's a good film. I'm glad it held up. It's not the funniest of Jim Carrey's movies, but it's not always trying to be funny. The hit rate is good when it's trying, and when it's doing sinister stuff, that's working also. It's a bit tonally like it's jumping between two places, but it mostly finds a good middle ground, and it works. And yeah, I found it very, very entertaining and quite compelling. How did you feel about it overall?
You took the word out of my mouth. Compelling is the word I would use. That's my biggest thing with this movie. It really sucked me in. And had me very engaged and watching it. I didn't. In fact, I will. I didn't want to say this because I wouldn't recommend anyone watches a movie this way. But needs must. In terms of my schedule this week. I watched this movie on the Elizabeth line, and I got on. I was basically almost going to pretty much the end of the Elizabeth line, and I got on at the start of the Elizabeth line, and just the train filled around me without me really noticing. Like, it really pulled me in, and I was on a train surrounded by people, and only at the end was very conscious suddenly that there were loads of people around me, probably reasonably going, is this guy watching The Cable Guy? At why is this guy sat on a train at 7 a.m. watching The Cable Guy?
My favourite thing about that is just the sort of Robin Williams Jumanji meme. What year is it?
But it's just not what anyone would have expected to see.
No, honestly, if I was on a train, I saw somebody watching The Cable Guy, I'd probably move to another carriage. Because there is no godly reason that someone should be doing that.
Especially because, like I say, it was like 7 a.m. It was early.
That is not 7 a.m. viewing.
But No, but I really enjoyed. But that's what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah, I
it
know.
really, I was very much like towards the end of it, like, oh shit, there's loads of people on this train now.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I think it is a really good film, and I'm glad that I'm glad you enjoyed it as well. Because I was pleasantly surprised by it, and I thought it's going to be hard to, if you don't enjoy it at all, if you hate this movie, it's going to be really hard for me to justify claiming anything but nostalgia is why I enjoyed it, because it was fun to rewatch it as well, just on the grounds of like, I was like, oh, I remember this scene's good, you know what I mean? There was an element of that, so I wouldn't have had much of a leg to stand on if you hadn't liked the movie. I don't think.
No, I thought it was great. I thought it was very captivating.
Yeah, cool. So it's time, Chris, say the thing.
Let's triv it up.
Give you some trivia. So it is time. Let's talk about this movie's development, because it's an interesting story. I'll go as quick as I can, because we talked about the film itself for a lot longer than I anticipated we would. When we were about 45 minutes an hour, I was like, yeah, we'll be wrapping this up soon. And we ended up going for another half an hour. So sorry about that, everyone. Hopefully people were interested in it, but yeah, we went longer than I was expecting. So this film was written by a gentleman called Lou Holtz Jr. He had the idea for the film while he was working as a prosecutor for the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. Not a screenwriter, no screenwriting background, but he basically once saw a cable company employee in the hallway of his mother's apartment building late at night and was thinking, why is he here so late? And it just percolated and became the idea for this movie. So the script was originally written in 1994 by him and was very different from the film we just watched. Fun, simple, silly, buddy comedy. The script ended in the hands of a talent agent called Bernie Brillstein, who liked the script and pitched it with one of his own clients in the lead role. That client being the absolute legend of Saturday Night Live and, my favourite Chris Farley movie, Beverly Hills Ninja, I think it was called, which I think by all accounts is probably a terrible movie, but I absolutely loved it. But yeah, talk about physical comedy, Chris Farley, absolute genius. So there was a bidding war. I've gone too soon about it. He died like a year after this came out, like 2 years after this came out. Very sad. And obviously, Chris Farley had been in and out of rehab at this point. And he was sort of like that Robert Downey Jr. thing with Iron Man, where he was doing a couple of movies, but he was not getting very much money for them, for considering what they were worth and how famous he was. But they were attached his name to this screenplay when they pitched it to Columbia Pictures, and they won with a bid of $1 million to get the rights to The Cable Guy, with Chris Farley attached as the lead. But Farley had actually signed a 2-picture deal with Paramount Pictures like a year before. He'd signed a 2-picture deal when he signed on to do Tommy Boy, which ultimately came out in 1995, and he still owed them one more movie. So they passed him a script for a film called Black Sheep, and that's what they were going to do, and the schedule for that, unfortunately, clashed heavily with Cable Guy. He was more creatively interested in Cable Guy, and also they were offering him a little bit more money for Cable Guy. So he actually tried to get out of doing Black Sheep by claiming the script wasn't ready yet and that it needed more work, which would have delayed shooting enough for him to then... Because he had a certain right of he had a certain amount of creative say on Black Sheep, and he didn't think the script was there. But his co-star David Spade told the story in his autobiography, and there's a YouTuber I'll be thanking a little bit later for this information, because I did not know anything about this part, and he had a brilliant video breaking down some of the history of this. And basically, David Spade had the option to just go, yeah, I agree, the script doesn't work, we need to take time, and that would have made it work, and Farley could have done both movies. But David Spade was like, nah, I think it's good, let's go. Which seems super shitty, because they were going to make the movie either way. And apparently when Spade called Chris Farley, he was like, come on, man, if the Cable Guy wasn't on the table and you weren't really interested in that, you'd want to do this movie. You'd be excited about this movie. But yeah, he took the decision away. Although, from reports, it may not have mattered if Farley could have done this movie or not. But David Spade certainly put the kibosh on that, because as soon as they were doing Black Sheep, he could not do Cable Guy. But it may not have mattered, because apparently the script got into the hands of Jim Carey, and he approached the studio with interest for doing it. And he has, as Chris pointed out earlier in this podcast, was on maybe one of the hottest streaks in comedy history. So yeah, immediately Farley was dropped. He was going to be given $3 million for the role. They offered Jim Carrey $20 million to star in the film, which was, at the time, the highest payday an actor had ever received for a single movie. This will come back up later, but this did not go down well in the industry. They thought they'd raised the ceiling and that other actors would start to demand similar salaries and that it could not be matched. There was a lot of bitterness towards that dumb cable guy movie. It created a lot of negative buzz in Hollywood that it was this big folly of a movie that was gonna they'd done a dumb thing. They'd spent way too much money on the star, and there was a negative vibe around this movie in Hollywood immediately. So we'll come back to that. Put a pin in that. Jim Carrey was negotiating the salary for the film for a little while, but he had insisted his attorneys wear Ace Ventura dressing gowns, so not to lose their sense of perspective while negotiating for $20 million. Play a little game, Chris. Jim Carrey paid $20 million for this movie. Do you want to put a figure on Ferris Bueller himself, Matthew Broderick? What do you reckon they paid Matthew Broderick?
Well, if Jim's getting 20, like you would assume minimum 10, like 15. Like what would Broderick get?
$2 million.
Jesus.
And I would argue he's the lead.
Yeah,
$2 million.
Yeah, I think he's the lead from a story perspective for sure. He's definitely the audience's way in.
Right,
Screen time and all that shit is probably even, but yeah.
Yeah, you're right. And I guess in terms of marketing, Jim Carrey's name is all over everything and his face. You know, Matthew Broderick does not feature on the iconic poster. That is true. But $2 million, absolutely shambles. I think that's embarrassing. I think you pay Jim Carrey 15 and you pay Matthew Broderick 10. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this is doing it the way they did it was silly, in my opinion. But anyway, once Carrey came onto the film, he also had some creative control, and he took advantage of that immediately. Got rid of the original writer, and brought Judd Apatow in to the project. He worked with him previously on a sketch show called In Living Color. So he liked Apatow, wanted Apatow on the project. The original writer, Lou Holtz, said, Carrey did not want to meet with me. Did not want to give me any notes. I was told I was out as soon as the studio made a deal with Apatow. So the original writer who'd done this script, they were just like, nah, we don't want you anymore. Jim's on. Jim wants Judd. Jim's getting Judd because we don't want to lose Jim. They were very convinced this was like a guaranteed hit. And I guess when you look at that run Chris talked about earlier, you know, Ace Ventura, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber, it's pretty hard to deny that it seemed like he was infallible at the box office. So we already talked about Jim Carrey's desire for the script to be darker, and Apatow being brought on to do that because I gave that quote earlier. It's here in my notes now, but it's the one where he said he didn't want to go stale creatively. So Apatow was responsible for turning it into a funny version of a classic stalker film. Apatow claimed there was no physical humour for Carey in the original version of the script. Carey described the finished product as Hitchcock meets Jerry Lewis and Rosemary's Baby meets The Odd Couple. So that's what they were going for. So originally Carey wanted Apatow to direct the movie too, but the studio did not agree. They declined that. They were happy to give him a certain amount of creative control, but they didn't trust Apatow with a picture of this magnitude. So they had a list of potential directors they were willing to consider, and one of the names on it was Ben Stiller. Apatow had just worked with Ben Stiller on Heavyweights and approached Stiller with the idea and the script and got him on board as a director after a meeting. Stiller was also into the movie. Now, I want to just point out here, here's another one of my red flags on Ben Stiller. I'm going to read you a quote from Ben Stiller, Chris, and I'll see if you can work out what about this sentence didn't ring right to me. This is from Ben Stiller after he's been brought on by Apatow and Carey. The original script was basically a silly buddy comedy. What I wanted to do was make a comedy that satirized the psycho thrillers like Cape Fear and Hand That Rocks the Cradle and Fatal Attraction. Did anything about that stand out to you, Chris, as a sentence?
Well, I guess I get it. Like that, I've not seen Fatal Attraction or Cape Fear, but those references, I understand them as points of references for the movie we got.
The issue more is the implication that he was the one who steered the movie to the darker direction. I'm going to repeat. Apatow and Carey had already made those changes, done the script, and pitched it to Stiller. And he says, what I wanted to do was make a comedy that satirised the psycho thrillers like Cape Fear and Fatal Attraction. Ben, buddy,
yeah, is that not just him saying, "Yeah, I want to do these events. I want to do that version too"?
No, that quote is from after the movie. This is like on the press tour for the movie.
Oh, right. I see what you mean. Right. Okay. Yeah. I see what you're saying.
What are you doing, Ben? You're the third person in this chain of events I wanted to do. Go fuck yourself, buddy. Anyway, maybe I'm reading too much into it. It's a small thing, but I just get the ick, man. I can't put my finger on it every time with Stiller. I can't put my finger on it, but it's true. Judd Apatow and Ben Stiller went to Carolina to meet Carey while he was shooting Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. Apparently, they actually specifically arrived and visited the set on the day of him shooting the iconic rhino scene. So that was where they had discussions on the script and where to take it after that. And at the bar, Carey came up with the idea of having his character push his chest up against the glass like in Midnight Express. And they apparently left the bar with a bar napkin, and one of them said tits on glass. But this is also where they came up with the idea to give the character a lisp, which is apparently inspired by a character called Dickie Peterson that Jim Carey had played on In Living Colour, which Apatow had written. So it was very much... we're in that zone of, thinking back to their previous work together. Now, sadly, despite all this work on the screenplay, Apatow was actually denied a screenwriting credit by the Writers Guild of America on this movie. He challenged the ruling, pointing out that he wrote much of the movie's dialogue and many of the scenes. But for whatever reason, he lost the arbitration battle, and Lou Holtz Jr. was the only credited writer on this movie, despite Apatow's work. The novelization apparently restored Judd's credit, but obviously his name's not on the movie, and it sounds like he made quite a lot of changes to it, and I really feel like the Screenwriters Guild fucked up massively there.
This really was a period where fucking everything was getting a novelization, isn't it?
Yeah,
yeah. It? Like, what's the cable guy?
Later on, we're going to learn what Owen Wilson's character was actually called, and that information comes from the novelization. Very exciting.
Like, then I never read it, but I, as a kid, had a novelization of Getting Even with Dad.
I had the novelization of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. That was my weird novelization that I don't know why I owned.
Yes, but I understand why the novelization for a Star Wars movie exists more than the cable guy on Getting Even with That.
That is an excellent point. You're correct. If we're just talking about why it exists rather than why I own it, there's a good case for one over the other for sure. But on the good news for Judd Apatow, he may have lost a screenwriting credit that he desperately deserved. Instead, he was just credited as a producer. But he did gain a wife because you may have noticed Leslie Mann's in this movie, and Leslie Mann and Judd Apatow happily married, as far as I know, still happily married. I've not checked that status in a few years. I assume they are. But basically, she came in to read, and Judd Apatow, as a producer, read Jim Carey's lines in the scene that was the reading scene, and that's how they met. And there's footage of that online, and I think that is adorable.
That's very adorable.
Oh, yeah, because as far as I know, they're still together. I should double check that. Yeah, no, he's still married to Leslie Mann. Perfect. Just double check.
At the time of recording.
Obviously,
we hope they're still. Obviously, we hope they're still married. But
Hollywood.
We record these so in advance that I don't know about you, Dan, but there have been instances, in fact, and I'm not going to say the instant because we don't need to go into it. I'm going to keep this vague. A huge news story broke yesterday, and I sat there and went, "Oh, have we talked about that person on like recent recordings?" Like, I genuinely, because I've talked about that person involved in that story quite a bit, and I'm going, "Is that on something we've recorded?" So,
yeah, maybe. Yeah, that's true. It's true. Probably not. There's only eight or so episodes that are recorded ahead now from that point. So I think we're okay. But yeah, it's happened a couple times this year. I mean, it happened with Biden being swapped out for Harris on the Democratic ticket. We talked about Biden and his chances on a podcast, and then like that podcast went out 5-6 weeks after that had changed. And it seems insane now, but there you go. That's the downside to recording these in advance. But it's the only way we can make sure the schedule is consistent. But yeah, Leslie Mann met Judd Apatow there. They're still happily married, which is lovely because, bloody Holly weird, am I right? You never know.
It's true.
Other actresses that were up for the part of Robin that I presume Judd Apatow read with and maybe could have potentially got married to. I mean, he had a delightful selection if he was looking to marry whoever played Robin.
Yeah, I doubt that was his main sort of criteria for a wife, but you never know.
100% a joke, 100% a bad joke. It was the actresses in question. Well, Jennifer Lopez, Selma Hayek, and Heather Locklear. So yeah, a lot of top tier sort of 90s talent. I mean, we literally just saw Jennifer Lopez in a movie last week on Rewatch Reviews, and she was delightful in it. So I think she probably would have made a good Robin. I don't think I'd prefer any of them over Leslie Mann, who I always enjoy. I think she always nails it. So, shrug. Like I have no impulse to reach for the remote control, not the remote control, the portal gun to go into another reality where that happened and see that version of the movie. Although those are all fine actresses, I'm quite happy with Leslie Mann personally. So I talked earlier, Chris, about there being two visual effects of note in the movie. One being the compositing of Jim Carrey onto the top of the satellite from the ground up for the shot in the satellite thing. The other one, Chris, is so much stranger. While filming the scene in which the cable guy plays basketball, it became obvious that Jim Carrey could barely dribble a basketball convincingly, never mind make a basket. So Ben Stiller reworked the scene. So there was a lot of just Jim Carrey standing there in people's way, knocking the ball out of people's hands. They changed all of it so he wasn't directly playing good basketball. But also, they had scenes where he had the ball shift, so he's just miming the action of a ball. And then the VFX team added a fake CGI basketball in post-production.
That's mad.
It's the only scene that I could see that it was I could spot it. Now I knew, and it's only because now I knew. I've never noticed that ever, and I'm not sure I would have done. It's the one when he first shows up and he's doing that double dribble where he's throwing one basketball down, throwing the other one over, and then down, and then he knocks one off his elbow. That shot is the most noticeable example of it. But isn't that fascinating?
That's wild, and I do have to say as well. The conclusion of that scene, like the notion that he's bad but still like interrupting and causing a pain in the game, like, but then also like you somehow believe that this guy who is awful also by treading on Jack Black is able to do that, and it's oddly satisfying to see someone who's so bad still fuck up the game, but fuck up the game by an amazing basket.
Right. Yeah, because even if that's not really within the spirit of the rules of the game, like, you're not really supposed to stand on your opponent to reach a basket. Like that would probably not be counted in an NBA game. But it is like it's still an incredible physical feat in of itself.
It's just really satisfying as a conclusion to that scene, yeah, I found.
I agree. And it doesn't hurt that you ruined the game thing at all.
No.
And speaking of, actually, when the basket was dunked, the backboard shattered the wrong way. It was supposed to go out away from his face, not towards it. But apparently the pyrotechnics didn't go off in the right place, and they pushed the glass out the wrong way. Unfortunately... not unfortunately because he had made the mistake, but the guy who'd wired it up was sadly fired immediately because obviously that's such a risky thing to happen. Thankfully no one was hurt. I believe the actual person who dunked the basket was Jim Carrey's stunt double rather than Jim Carrey. But they still ended up using the shot of the glass going outwards in towards him because obviously thankfully no one was hurt, so you could do that without it feeling like exploitative. It's always interesting when injuries make it into movies, like the Mission Impossible Fallout, when Tom Cruise leapt from that building and he broke his ankle, and even in the finished movie, when you see the shot of him pulling himself up and walking away from that stunt, he's limping for about half a second on screen, and it's because he actually broke his foot. That's like a real limp, you know. Or the other one that everyone always talks about, which is obviously in Lord of the Rings, when Viggo Mortensen breaks his toe because he kicks the helmet too hard. I don't know if you remember that one. People always talk about that one. But anyway, so yeah, I always think that's really interesting when, like, you know, essentially real life potential injuries work their way into the actual finished movie. Another moment that was played out genuinely, and the reactions are genuine, is the scene at Medieval Times where the cable guy, Chip, asks Stephen for his chicken skin and does a sequence or does some dialogue from Silence of the Lambs, was not scripted, not remotely. It was just something Carey did on one take, and still loved that moment so much he decided to keep it in the film, because Matthew Broderick's reaction, you know, his sort of laugh, him trying to suppress it, are all super genuine, but also actually really work for the character, because it's like, in the context of the movie, he's laughing despite himself. Like, he's laughing even though he doesn't want to laugh, because he doesn't really want to engage Chip. So it ends up playing out brilliantly. But it's actually, what's actually happening is it's an actor desperately trying not to laugh because he doesn't want to ruin the take. It's a delightful moment. If anyone gets a chance to just watch that moment, knowing that, it's so fun. It's really nice.
Yeah.
Let's see, what's the next one? Oh yeah. Oh, we already talked about the amount of improvisation Jim Carrey did on the set. Left Matthew Broderick going to Ben Stiller and being like, "I'd have no more reactions for this man." And I assume probably a little bit related to that moment, but there you go. So we already covered this one. Yeah, so we talked a bit about the conspiracy theory, the subplot theory that actually Jim Carrey's Chip character was responsible for killing one of the Sweet brothers. But there's another element here. The novelization strongly implies that Sam Sweet did get found guilty of that murder. So yeah, novelization strikes again. So we kind of know the outcome, probably based on an early version of the script, having the outcome in it maybe, and then it being taken out, but obviously not in time. But yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing considering that thread has run through the entire movie. It's amazing how you don't sit there as an audience member frustrated. Like, I didn't once go, well, are they guilty or not? Like, even though that court case has been threaded throughout the entire thing.
Yes. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that's it's kind of a compliment to the film that it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So, Owen Wilson's character is just credited as Robin's date, but the novelization also gives us this gem. Are you ready, Chris? This is the most exciting thing you're going to hear all day. You ready? You sitting down?
Yep.
The character is called Ray. Such good news. Like, very exciting.
That is worth knowing.
Yeah, for sure. So, another bit of information we got from the novelization, I know it doesn't end there, is when the cable guy menaces Stephen with a late-night phone call, the novelization tells us he's making the call from Robin's air duct above her cupboard, which he's seen crawling in earlier in the movie. That's why Daddy Longlegs crawls across his face during the scene and explains why he has Robin as a hostage for the rest of the scene. In the next scene, sorry. So yeah, there you go. So Jim Carrey was kind of obsessed with this movie ending with Chip dying. He really wanted to complete that story. But everyone else basically disagreed and preferred the ending as was. I agree with everyone else. I don't think it matters that Chip dies.
Yeah. Also, I just really love that it's the horror movie ending.
Yes, agreed.
Which I really like.
Yeah. Yep. So the irony of the work to shift this script to a dark comedy is that, according to the New York Times, when Columbia Pictures and the producers finally got a screening of the movie, they were dismayed at the tone. This has not been the summer blockbuster they'd anticipated, but they could not move the release. It's similar to when we talked about Toy Story 2 having a really fixed release date because of promotional stuff already being printed. And there'd already been some money spent on like 7-Eleven Big Gulp cups and posters with the dates on, and the cups had the dates on, and there was just really no moving it. And they saw it quite close to release and were like, damn. So instead, what they did was make Ben Stiller and I presume Apatow as a producer sit down and take a bunch of little moments out from the third act. So we talked about this earlier, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that this was noticeable to you. You said the third act felt faster and that the scenes almost always came too quick and there was like no conjoining material. So a couple of things that were removed. So you know when he's in the car park and all the lights of the cars come on and you hear the voice and then he just runs off and it moves to the next scene? That was a whole sequence in which he got in the car, started driving, saw Chip in front of him, put his foot down, ran Chip over, but Chip rolled through the window, held onto the back of the car, and then Matthew Broderick's character sort of skids to throw him off and then drives off into the night. It's a weird scene. It's on the DVD, so it's on YouTube if anyone wants to see it. It's bizarre. It's very tonally out of place. I'm almost glad they cut it.
Yeah.
There's also another bit, Chris, when he first goes to save Robin at the satellite. Obviously, the cable guy knows he's coming. He's kind of set it up that way on purpose. So when he gets out of the car and he's walking towards the satellite, he hears the clip-clops of horse hooves, and he starts being chased down by Chip on horseback. Super weird.
What?
Yep.
On horseback?
He's on a horse. He's on a horse for some reason. This leads
to... Is that
to...
also on the DVD, did you say?
Yep, you can see it. Yep. This leads to a big fight in a mud puddle before the big fight on the satellite. And Matthew Broderick's character nearly murders Chip with a big rock by crushing his head.
Well, that all seems crazy.
Now... These moments being cut out are notable because then they were on the DVD and we could see them. But if they took a bunch of that stuff out for being maybe just slightly over the line, to try and rebalance the movie because Columbia Pictures saw it and went, this is way too dark. Fine. Thumbs up. No problem. Makes sense to me. But it does potentially explain why some of the connective tissue between the scenes doesn't feel there and the third act feels maybe a little too pacey for its own good if we've removed a bunch of moments like that, which are all from the third act, because they probably would have paced it out better.
Yeah.
And there's probably a bunch of scenes that weren't noteworthy enough, or trims that weren't noteworthy enough to go on a DVD as an extra and be a whole scene. But almost every sequence, I imagine, was trimmed in some way towards the end of the movie to sort of adjust the tone. So yeah, I think that's, again, very astute of you, Chris, because you picked up on that without having read it in the trivia first. So we're barreling towards the end. Let's quickly talk about box office, then we can wrap this sucker up. So the final gross of the movie was 60 million domestically and 102 million worldwide. Now, the history of this movie is it's always been painted as a massive box office failure. But the movie only cost $47 million to make. And they didn't, and 20 million of that was Jim Carey, and 2 million of that was Matthew Broderick. So the movie only cost about 20 million to make. And they did not spend very much money on Matthew Broderick. On promotion. They didn't spend very much money on Matthew Broderick either. Not the point I was trying to make in that moment, though. They didn't spend a lot on marketing, because they were hoping just Jim Carey would be enough, basically. So the idea that the movie was a big disaster was actually circulated deliberately by rival studios because they were angry about Columbia setting a higher market for star salaries by giving Jim Carey $20 million. Remember I said to put a pin in that earlier in this podcast, Chris? This is where it comes back. So the fact that the common assumption that this movie was a box office failure was actually, it's not really true. It was profitable. Probably didn't make a lot of money, and it certainly didn't make, Ace Ventura or The Mask money or Dumb and Dumber money. But it made its budget back and then a chunk of change for everyone to go home with reasonably happy. So yeah, that story is fiction. It was put around in the trades as an attempt to discredit the idea of paying a star that much so that other studios wouldn't have to do the same. So
that's mad.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah. So, I mean, to be fair, I would still consider this movie somewhat a failure. I think, if you're looking at how much money the previous 3 or 4 Jim Carrey movies made, it is a failure. It doesn't match that, and therefore doesn't justify his hefty 20 million payday. But if we're just going purely on did the movie make money, yeah, turned a small profit. Or at the very worst, even if you want to say they did a load more marketing than has been reported, broke even. And that's just at the box office.
What about...
And that doesn't include licensing and DVDs and VHSs that have come out since.
Yeah, well, didn't they do... I don't know if this is in the trip, but, he reprised the role, didn't he? For, a Verizon commercial or something.
Yes.
So...
There wasn't really much truth about that, but yeah, he did bring the character back in a Verizon commercial. I've seen it. It's very short, but it is, it's Chip. Chip was back installing cable. It's pretty weird.
And what I'm saying is, that doesn't happen. Do you know what I mean? The movie's got to be relatively in the public conscious to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I do think it is somewhat of a cult classic now. I think that people do sort of, I think it does have a little fan base. It's not a huge fan base. It's certainly not talked about at the level of Jim Carrey's other movies, but it's up there, I'd say. I would argue. So, the movie underperforming was attributed by the studio to Jim Carrey deviating from his conventional physical comedy style in lieu of a much darker comedy, a switch not appreciated in their view by the fans. So when revenues were below the predictions after the film's opening, the studio tried to shift the focus of the advertising towards the more physical comedy elements, and they changed the original iconic poster of Carey, demonically grinning with the cable all on fire or lightning-y. They changed it with a screenshot from a more light-hearted moment in the movie, the medieval times moment with him in the silly getup. Unfortunately, this strategy did very little to improve the movie's box office. I think damage done. I don't necessarily think they're bang on about this, by the way. The movie has plenty of the physical comedy. I think they're right to suggest the marketing didn't lean into that, but I don't think that's the movie's fault. I don't think it's that the movie was too dark for audiences. I think the marketing implied the movie was darker than it was. That's what I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. As evidenced by yourself, Chris. You literally were like, oh yeah, it didn't look like it was for me. I was just like, horror movie, don't think I'm interested in that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's time for my favourite segment. Is Cars Exist? It's a good car noise, Chris. You did a good job there. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I felt good about that one.
Yeah,
for sure.
You nailed it. So, very quickly, and I didn't even have to go to the Internet Movie Card Database. For those who don't know, sometimes, for some reason, on IMDb in the trivia section, they just name the models of cars that the actors are in the movie, and for some reason, I found that amusing enough to turn it into a segment we are still doing to this day, called Cars Exist, because they exist, Chris. This week in Cars Exist, Rick's car, that's a 1970 Volkswagen Kaman Gaia convertible Type 14. Stephen drives a 1984 Jeep Cherokee XJ, and Chip / the Cable Guy, his van is a 1992 GMC Vandura G25 model, obviously, which we all knew.
I categorically knew that, obviously.
Yeah, I spot the G25 GMC Vandura from 1992 at a glance every time. Easy.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Jess is fed up of me pointing them out.
Yeah. She's sick of it. Good job you didn't watch this movie with her. She'd have been annoyed.
Yeah.
Not another bloody GMC Vandura G25, Chris. You're like, yeah. You're doing the point E meme from Leo. It's time then, Chris, for us to do either my most dreaded or most enjoyable part of this podcast. Sometimes it's where we're going next, because sometimes this is an anxiety moment and sometimes this is a fun thing. The next episode is going to be December, I think 17th. I think so. We're in range of Christmas. So I assume you don't have to. There's not a hard rule, but I assume you're potentially going to pick a Christmas movie. And if we decided to leave it in, there was a moment before we recorded this podcast where it occurred to me that because we're recording this in October, I should make sure Chris was aware that he'd have to choose a Christmas movie.
Yeah, which I was not aware.
Yeah.
That's not. I said that. That sounded like I was shitty. Like, yeah, no, it wasn't Dan's fault. I wasn't aware. Like, yeah, no, I didn't realize that at all.
No, honestly, I nearly missed
look,
it myself. It was literally just a bit of luck that I glanced at the dates and the calendar thing before we recorded.
I feel like in a world where we're doing proper, like we seem to, like I don't like, and feel free to like. I hate where we do a thing where we sort of slightly tie seasons to themes, but sometimes there are naturally themes. And I think we sort of went into, it feels like we both went into this season going, we want to do the premise movies, let's call them. Movies that absolutely fulfill the brief of, from the era, do they hold up? Do you know what I mean? Like, I can't see one of us picking a movie from 2021 to sort of mess with, do you know what I mean? Like, for example, Safety Guaranteed is a movie that I really want to do at some point on here, but it just doesn't feel maybe tonally what we're going for this series. You're free to disagree. We both, I reserve the right to change my mind on that, but I don't know. It feels like sometimes there's something in the air this series.
I think after sequel season where we were sort of not forced, but found ourselves doing lots of much more recent movies. I think we're naturally going to lean that way. I don't think it's going to be necessarily the whole season. I don't rule out the possibility we might do something a bit more modern at some point this series. But I'm definitely content for most of this series to be sort of what I would call classic Rewind reviews fare, in the sense of, like, these are, as you said, premise movies that fit the premise of this podcast really cleanly, which is this is a movie we watched when we were younger. Does it hold up? Whereas last year in sequel season, we did like Dial of Destiny and Avatar 2. These are not movies we saw in our youth, and we're checking if they held up. Yeah, these were sequels we were getting to because we'd already reviewed the early ones. So yeah.
And in a way, I feel like the Christmas movie that most fits that brief, the Christmas movie that is most classic Rewind review, we've not done yet, and it's one that has been as equally teased, I think, as you with your choice, which you've already revealed. And I won't spoil here in case people don't remember or know. And I feel like I specifically have on a number of occasions brought the film up and gone, we'll have to do that at some point. And I think the does it hold up question is fascinating for this movie. So as Dan will have already guessed,
yes,
we are going to finally tackle Home Alone.
Yes. There were two movies that could have been, though. I was confident it was Home Alone, but I think your exact description there could have also fit Elf. That's another movie.
Well, I was going to say I don't know if I said, but in my head when I was like preparing an intro, it was Elf or Home Alone I was wrestling with, and I was going to say it could be two movies. I think I think it fits it slightly more Home Alone, slightly A because of the time frame, and B because actually I didn't watch Elf that young. One of my temptations for Elf is we've inadvertently. And it feels so offensive to say because, this film is a co-lead between Matthew Broderick and Jim Carey, but we've sort of done vehicles, like, so far this year. And I kind of, when I didn't think it was a Christmas movie, I wanted to do a movie that was a vehicle. Like, I was trying to think of a movie that was like a vehicle for Kate Winslet or Tom Hanks, or like, do you know what I mean? Like, I toyed with Forrest Gump. Like, I wanted to do, I liked the idea of a trilogy of like vehicle movies, and I was slightly tempted by Elf because I liked the idea of essentially doing vehicle movies for three 90s naughty stars. But I'm pretty sure Home Alone's been teased a lot. And I think Home Alone, as a choice of mine, fits that brief way more than Elf. Although Elf is an interesting one because I have historically not been overly kind to Elf, or at least said that it's not the movie for me that it is for everyone else. But I think there's more of a does it hold. If I'm betting now, despite my personal feelings about Elf, I would suspect if we watched both together, which we're not going to do, but we'll get to Elf at some point, I would suspect we'd think Elf. My gut instinct is that actually Elf probably holds up better than Home Alone, so we shall see.
Well, yeah, I was on board with the idea of you doing vehicle movies because, my favourite segment is Cars Exist. Bump, bump, so I'm held my tongue on that joke until you were finished speaking for quite some time, Chris. To the point that I basically mangled the delivery.
You also?
To the point where I basically mangled the initial delivery I'd planned in my head.
It's all good. It's all good. And I realised also, vehicle was never going to become a thing for the whole season because your choice for Christmas movie is anything but a vehicle movie.
Yes. Yeah, I'm excited about that. But it's something I've been threatening / promising for a long time, depending on your perspective. So I can't wait to talk about that. But that's so. I think this one.
And I feel like that's the case for Home Alone as well.
Yeah,
I feel like Home Alone has been teased a lot.
Yeah, I would say so, for sure. So yeah, I think if my memory serves me correctly, 17th of December, we're going to release Home Alone. And then the choice... Should I just say it? Because we have said it on previous podcasts. I don't think... Does it matter?
You can say it, yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to do Muppets Christmas Carol on the 24th of December. It's going to come out on Christmas Eve, which I think, can I just say, considering the story of Christmas Carol, that's pretty good.
Yeah, definitely.
A movie about Christmas Eve coming out, our review of it coming out on Christmas Eve. So yes, all in for both those movies. Very excited about it. The only thing I'm looking at is like potentially recording Home Alone sooner than not, and that's gonna be a deep dive on Triv. I think that's gonna have a lot of Triv. I reckon big iconic movie like that. I think they did the films that made us on it as well. I think there's some interesting stuff in there, so I'm going to do some deep diving. But anyway, very excited about that. Obviously, you can get us all the usual places. If you want to hear Home Alone or the Muppets Christmas Carol episode a week earlier than we have currently got them scheduled, so you'd hear Home Alone on the 10th of December, and you would hear Muppets Christmas Carol on 24th. No, that's the same date it's currently coming out, the 17th. Then you can head over to patreon.com/nothing-but-static. Where for as little as $1 a month you get access to episodes of our podcast a whole week ahead of their normal release. That's for Rewind Reviews and our other podcast, which is currently on hiatus because there's no new Avatar stuff. We're talking about analysing Avatar, which will at some point probably return based on the fact that we know that they're working on new Avatar movies and shows. So that'll be coming back at some point. But yeah, that's everything. Oh, yeah, support is in all the usual ways. You can like and subscribe on all the various platforms, youtube.com/nothingmutstatic.uk, or you can head over to whatever your podcast platform of choice is and give us a nice review, or a like, or a poke, or a thumbs up, or you can tell a friend, or you can just keep listening. That we appreciate as well. Yeah, I think that's all the things. Oh, yeah, if you have thoughts, mail@nothingmutstatic.co.uk, or you can head over to the Patreon. When you join up, you get access to our Discord, and from the Discord, you can then message us. We're on there. Dan or whatever. I don't know if the ats work on Discord, but whatever. I'll see it. Yeah, your thoughts can come that way. So yeah, we appreciate you very much for listening. This is a bit of an odd one. It's a cult classic, but it's not like a big hitter. So I suspect this podcast was listened to by a very specific audience, and I hope those people enjoyed it because it was very much for you. But with that said, I'm going to hand over to Chris, who ends this thing.
Yes, indeed. My name's Chris Billingham.
My name's Dan Doolan.
And this review has been rewound.